The theory of gestural phonology is about as motor-based as theories get, and it has particularly useful applications to certain kinds of speech sound changes and processes. It's a bit more mathematical and model-based than most other theories, which concern themselves with the inner workings of the linguistic mind, and its primary focus is on the relative timing and scaling of the movements of different articulators. The basis of gestural phonology is the gesture, which can be thought of as an articulatory primitive, meaning that all speech sound movement patterns are made up of combinations of various gestures. You can think of a gesture as a core movement of an articulator, and typically, for a movement pattern to become a gesture, it has to be very well practiced. This practice solidifies a sequence of muscle contractions that, when performed together, produce the target movement pattern. And it's this movement that creates some form of constriction in the vocal tract that leads to the acoustic result of speech sounds. At its simplest, a gesture will involve an articulator and a movement pattern. This pattern will occur over some period of time, so each gesture will have a duration, and movement patterns will have a certain intensity to them, which is often referred to as the scale or the magnitude of the movement. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that movements of a single articulator very rarely occur in isolation. So as soon as you've identified a particular articulatory gesture, you'll also want to look at the other articulators to see what they're doing during that gesture as well. So gestural phonology accounts of speech phenomena almost always show the combined activities of several different gestures that are carried out across a certain amount of time. Sometimes certain gestures happen sequentially, that is, the time frames of the different gestures do not overlap. And other times certain gestures happen with some degree of overlap. In other words, different gestures might occur at the same time such that they completely overlap, or one gesture might begin while another gesture is still ongoing, and the later gesture might end after the initial gesture has completed, such that they partially overlap. Because there are several articulators that can produce gestures, it can be necessary to show the relative timing of the different articulators' gestures. This is typically done by using what's called a gestural score. The way to think of this is just like a musical score. If you've played an instrument in an orchestra, you probably have seen that what they give each player has only their one part written out. What the conductor sees, though, is the score of the piece. This shows each individual part written out, one part on top of another, in a way that shows the relative timing of the playing of the different parts. And just like a musical score has a line for each instrument, a gestural score will have a line for each articulator that can move with relative independence. So in most cases, you'll see a line for the movement of the larynx, another for the movement of the velum, and then a set of lines for the oral articulators, usually including the lips, the tongue tip, and the tongue back. These lines are customarily called tiers, mostly because they correspond to an organizational framework for sound features that's referred to as nonlinear phonology. It's nonlinear precisely because the features are thought to stack on top of each other, such that the time course of productions of segments, which we tend to think of in left-right terms because we tend to think of things that happened earlier as to the left and things that happened later as to the right, are contrasted with the organization of features within a given sound. These features are thought of as organized into an up-down plane. Specifically, this up-down plane is not in the same line as the left-right orientation of the speech sound segments on a timeline. Now, this is a very basic description of what someone means when they say nonlinear phonology. And because gestural phonology makes use of the same kind of up-down plane to represent tiers of phonetic features, gestural phonology should be thought of as one of the nonlinear phonological theories. Now, when movement patterns are placed in a time sequence relative to one another, you'll see that some articulators move in a time frame that's relative to the movements of another articulator. The relative difference in timing of the movements of these different articulators is what's referred to as the phasing of these movements. And what you'll see is that the phasing of certain movements relative to certain other movements can give a particularly compelling and elegant description of why a certain speech sound might end up with a specific acoustic quality. At this point, we've covered the basic terminology of gestural phonology. We'll see how all this looks in graphical form in the next segment.